Hi everybody, today I'm going to be reviewing this knife here. This is the MBK Knives Slayback, and I recently used this knife in a comparison video between three different flip joints, Civivi Appellation Drifter and the CRKT Symmetry. If you've already seen that video, there isn't going to be too much new information in this one for you, but if you haven't seen that video or you're only interested in the Slayback, then hopefully this will be helpful. Now, this is a non-locking knife, which means I would usually start the review by saying that if you live in a country where a lock isn't a legal issue, there is no legal restrictions on carrying a knife with a lock, then I would encourage you to buy a locking knife instead. Something like maybe the Civivi McKenna or the Benchmade Bug Out, something like that. That does still apply in this case to some extent. A locking knife is always going to be safer than a non-locking knife. However, this knife does some things well enough that I could completely understand why someone in a country without legal restrictions on locking knives would still be interested in one and still want to buy one. But we're going to get onto that more a little bit later. We'll start like usual with size comparisons. So we'll bring in a couple of classics. First, here is a Kershaw bare knuckle and a Spyderco PM2. You can see that it is considerably shorter than both of those, with an overall length of 6 3/4 inches. You can see that the blade is also considerably shorter, with it having a 3-inch blade, which is the legal line in the UK for a non-locking knife that you could carry without a good reason. Here's a Spyderco UK PK, another knife that comes in the same category as the Slayback legally, and the same with the Hinderer XM Slippy. The weight on the Slayback is 2.1 ounces, which is very light. It's not unbelievably light. It's not as light as a Benchmade Bug Out, which you just saw, but it is light. A lot of people use the ounce and inch ratio to compare. So this knife has a 3-inch blade, so it would be a fairly light knife if it weighed 3 ounces. It weighs 2.1 ounces, which is considerably below the ounce and inch ratio, so it is rather light. Now, deployment. The MBK Knives Slayback has just an absolutely wonderful action, as you're seeing. It is a very strong selling point for this knife. It has a wonderful flipper tab, which is very comfortable to use in a couple of different ways. You can use it like a normal flipper, you can use it like a thumb flipper, or kind of like a front flipper, that's the word I was looking for, like a front flipper almost. Lovely flipper tab. It's jimped, it has plenty of grip, but it's not uncomfortable. Now, unlike most flip joint knives, the MBK here has a single detent, which means there is, I may be able to show you it on camera, but I think I managed in the video before. Yes, so you will see there's no contact on this side of the blade, but there is something contacting the blade on this side. That is the single detent bar that is in this knife. You can see that one detent bar contacting that side of the blade. Now, what that means is the knife is using the same detent for the open and the closed position because it only has one detent. What that means is that sometimes the closed position detent, the detent which you're feeling when you open the knife, can be a little bit stiff, and the detent that holds the knife open can be a little bit weak, because instead of having a strong open detent, like something like the Civivi Appellation Drifter has a pretty decent detent when it's open, and a much softer one when it's closed, because it's using two detents. You can see there's contact on both sides of the blade there. So it's using two separate detents, which gives them far more control over the way the open and closed position detents feel. You can control them more individually. This knife only has one. The upside to that is, that means there's only one detent ball rubbing against the blade as it moves, which means this knife feels far smoother. And you can see that in how it will drop shut. It's actually quite difficult to not pop this knife closed straight away like that. But if we just edge it closed a little, you can see that it will just a little shake, it will fall shut, which is rather nice. So it is far smoother. Upsides and downsides really to that construction, but smoother. Detents maybe a little stiff in the closed position, and maybe a little weak in the open position. Now, as you start to close the Slayback, this jimped piece down here starts to kind of raise up out of the handle. And that is a very clever piece of design, really, because it means if you're holding the knife, how you would naturally when you're using it, the knife won't close on your fingers, because as the knife starts to close, this piece lifts up. If your hand's there holding that piece down, the knife isn't going to close on your fingers. And that's great. Now, it's not as reliable a safety feature as you would get on something like a Spyderco UKPK, where you put your finger in this big finger choil and then the knife really can't close on your finger, or at least it's way less likely than it is with a knife like this. Even though this is quite a clever safety feature in my opinion, it's not going to be as secure as the finger choil, and that's not going to be secure as just having a knife with a lock that just won't close on your fingers no matter what you do. But it's a lot better than nothing, and I don't think this design would really work with a finger choil. I think putting a finger choil on this knife would look very, very odd. So I understand why they didn't, and if you're not going to put a finger choil on it and it's going to be a non-locking knife, this is really good because it is going to give you more security, and it means that I'm not too worried about using this knife. It feels a lot safer than something like the Civivi Appalachian Drifter, which doesn't have this at all. There's nothing to stop this knife closing on your fingers, which is something I talk about in its review and in the comparison video. So, rather happy about that. Overall, this knife is safer than I expected and probably safer than you might expect as well. The materials on this knife are also wonderful. It's available in 3 different versions, or at least 3 different versions that I've seen. The raindrop carbon fibre, which I have here, the regular carbon fibre, and full titanium. The full titanium one is about $20 more expensive, which in the grand scheme of things is not a huge amount of money when we pay like 50 quid more for a titanium Olight or something like that. $20 more for a full titanium version is not that much. There are also some black coated DLC versions, like there are with the EWC, but like with the EWC, they seem to be very, very rare. I originally ordered the traditional CF version, non-raindrop pattern CF, and they sent me this one by mistake, and more or less as soon as I got it, I sent them a message and say, hey, you've sent me the raindrop one by mistake. I'd quite like to keep it anyway, because the raindrop looked way better to me in person than it did in photos, and I do love the way that it picks up light differently. I think it's a really interesting material, and as some of you may know from the channel, I am a big fan of carbon fibres, interesting carbon fibres, so yes, I really like this material. And the traditional CF also looks very good. It looks like they're using really nice CF. There certainly isn't any voids in this. And yes, you do have the full titanium version if that is your style. The build quality is fantastic. There is a slight curve to the edge of this knife. Do I have anything straight enough to show that? I have this coaster. Yeah, so you might be able to see there that the tip is not entirely touching, and if the tip is touching, the back isn't touching. So there's a slight curve to this blade, and I don't know if it's supposed to be like that necessarily. So maybe that is a fit and finish issue kind of thing, but it certainly isn't one that bothers me. It isn't one that you're going to notice functionally, really, unless perhaps if you're sharpening it on a flat stone, but even then I would think you would get enough variance to sharpen the whole edge anyway. Not really an issue. Other than that, nothing to complain about with this knife. It is wonderfully put together. The fit and finish on everything feels fantastic. The action feels fantastic. And it was all fantastic out of the box. I didn't get it and feel the need to adjust everything, so that's very, very nice. Speaking of adjusting things, this Monterey Bay knife is the easiest knife to disassemble I have ever owned. 3 screws and the knife's apart. 1, 2, 3. All of them are T8. There isn't a single T6 screw on this knife, which is so wonderful. I mean, this knife has T6 screws, this has T6 screws, this has T6 screws, this has T6 screws, this has T6 screws, T6 screws, T6 screws. I think maybe even T6 screws on the... No, I don't think they are T6 screws. The symmetry is certainly T6 screws. Every knife company has been overusing T6 screws, and almost... Yeah, that was how I expected that to go. And almost every knife enthusiast doesn't like T6 screws, so I don't know why they're still using T6 screws. I really dislike T6 screws. And that kind of reared its head on the symmetry, which you might hear about in the review. Actually, I don't know if I mentioned it in the review, but this knife killed one of my Leatherman T6 bits. Just a lot to do with the T6 bit, but it probably wouldn't have happened with a bigger bit if they'd used bigger screws, which Monterey Bay have, and I love that. It's also, the clip screws are also T8, which is fantastic. Every screw on this knife is T8. You can take the whole thing apart with only one driver. It's wonderful. All the screws also seem to be wonderful quality. Everything on this knife seems to be wonderful quality. Very impressed with it. Now, let's talk about the clip a little. This is a really lovely clip. It is 3D machined titanium. It's got quite good retention to it. I like it in the pocket. It's smooth in and out. There's nothing rough underneath. You can see that they also didn't put this channel on the clip side of the knife. It isn't reversible, which is a bit of a shame, but I kind of understand why they did that, because they're going for a very kind of clean, minimalist look with the sterile blade and everything. So I understand why they did it. It doesn't carry particularly deep, if that's something that bothers you. The carry depth on this knife is only about there, so you do have about that much knife sticking up out your pocket. That isn't something that really bothers me, but it might be something that bothers you. One of the reasons that I do love this clip so much is it's remedied across the top, which is, I know you should be able to see that fairly clearly on camera. It's remedied across the top of this clip, and it just makes such a difference in your hand. You wouldn't expect a little bit of remedying like that to make as much of a difference on the top of the clip as it actually does. But in your hand it makes a huge difference. It just don't get any hot spots off the clip at all. It feels really nice. It's one of my favourite clips in my hand. Now I have snagged it and bent it out once or twice, which is not great. It was probably mostly my fault. In fact, it was probably entirely my fault. But I was a little bit concerned that with it being a 3D machined clip, it might be kind of irreparable. I might try and bend it back, it might snap, I don't know. I was a little bit worried about it. So I was quite relieved when I did try and bend it back, and it bent back really nicely. It's bent back really nicely, I think, twice now. And I've got it back to the retention that I want, so the clip seems to be pretty durable, which is great. And of course, held in with these lovely T8 screws, it's very easy to take off and bend back. Now, the Slayback has a Wharncliffe style blade, which is essentially a straight edge blade. Sometimes people do Wharncliffes which aren't completely straight. This Kirscher bare knuckle, for example, they call this a modified Wharncliffe blade, but usually Wharncliffe blades are straight edges. I love Wharncliffes personally. If you don't, then maybe have a look at the Monterey Bay EWC, which is a very, very similar knife to this one, but it has a more traditional blade shape. I do love Wharncliffe, so especially for EDC type tasks. They really excel at cutting into packages and that kind of thing. They're wonderful for it. And this MBK, the whole blade's very nice, to be honest with you. It's nice and thin at the tip. It's certainly not overly thick, but it's not quite as thin as something like the, where did I put it? The Civivi Appalachian Drifter, which has a tip which is so thin that I am rather concerned about it. So it's not thin enough that I'm worried about it for general EDC stuff, but it's nice and thin and slicey. The whole blade is fairly highly ground and comes down to nice and thin behind the edge. So it slices really rather well, especially given that the blade thickness it's actually a rather thick blade for a knife of this type, which is a little bit unusual, but it does make sense, because the thickness of the blade is also giving you the thickness of your flipper tab. And because this flipper tab is thicker, it's going to be more comfortable in digging to your finger less. So I think they made quite a good decision really here with how they've done this blade. They also need to get a couple of extra bonus points for hiding the steel label so well. Let me see if I can actually find it. There's dirt on it. There we go. It says M390 there. There's a little bit of dirt on the 9, but it says M390 there. You can't see it in the closed position, and you can't see it in the open position, which is really nice because you don't need to. But it's nice that they are still labeling their steel. I don't really like unlabeled steel, but I think doing that is really rather nice. The only other marks on this blade are the MBK logo here and R. Laconico for Ray Laconico, who was the designer of this knife, on the spine. Lovely, lovely blade, made out of M390, which is a top of the line steel. It's going to have great edge retention. It's going to have great corrosion resistance. It's a lovely knife. I'm very happy with the blade on this, especially, as I say, for opening boxes and that kind of thing. Now, speaking of boxes, this knife didn't come in one. I ordered this knife direct from Monterey Bay Knives themselves. That seems to be the only way to get them. They don't seem to be going through any distributors at the moment. And it came in this lovely Monterey Bay Knives zip pouch, which I now use all the time, because unlike most, it actually has a couple different pockets in it. So if I'm going away, for example, I could put a UK legal carry in and a locking knife in, so that I've got some different options covered. That kind of thing. So I really like this pouch a great deal. And the knife came in this pouch, but this pouch was not in a box like with a Civivi. It just came in this pouch, and I think that's really nice because we don't really need a knife box. And I do think shipping a knife with something like this is great, because it's a way more useful thing if I'm traveling or something like that than just shipping the knife in a box. There was also a Monterey Bay Knives branded microfiber cloth in there, which is also a nice touch. I think that they couldn't do that if they were selling these knives through other distributors. If a big company like Blade HQ with a massive warehouse had lots of these sitting around which don't have any specific labeling on them, it might be a bit difficult for them to keep track of the raindrop carbons or the traditional carbons or titaniums. So I think they can only really do that because they're sending out the knives themselves. So, like I said, this knife was designed by Ray Laconico, who designed both the Slayback and the EWC. This is a typical Ray Laconico design, really. This groove down the middle of the handle is becoming a very kind of classical Laconico feature. When I see a knife with one of these, I'm pretty confident it's a Ray Laconico design. The ergonomics are great. Like I said, the clip makes such a huge difference, but there is also a contour to the scales, which is a little bit harder to see because it's a much more mild contour. But there is definitely a contour over the top of both scales, which really helps it in the hand. Now, it's quite a fairly straightforward design, I guess, really. You know, there's no curves or fancy bits in the handle like with something along the lines of the bare knuckle, where you've got like a choil and, you know, it tells you where to put your hand. There's none of that on this knife. It's a very straightforward handle design, but the contouring, it really does feel rather good, and it feels better than I expected it to feel for a knife with as kind of straight lines as this one has. Feels lovely to use. Now let's talk about the value. This is a £150 knife, at least in the UK, including shipping. I honestly think they could charge more than that. Don't get me wrong, I'm glad that they're not, but I do think they could charge more than that, and I have absolutely spent more money on a worse knife than this. One of the downsides for me is that it is made in China, which is something that I'd like to see them do. One of these which is made in a different country, a country with some slightly better workers' rights, ideally. But it is made very well, and the price is very good, and the materials are excellent. It feels like a very premium product. The whole experience, getting it in its nice fancy pouch, the quality of the product, it all feels very premium. So I certainly think that the £150 price is absolutely justified. Now, £150 is still quite a lot of money for a knife. If you're looking to get your first UK legal carry, or you just want something less expensive, then maybe have a look at something like the Heine Haynes CRKT pillar. Or for a bit more money than that, about halfway, you could get maybe a Spyderco UK PK. But if you're okay with the price and you've decided that you definitely want a flip joint, I really do highly recommend the Slayback. And I haven't had one, but I would assume, based on their construction and the materials and everything being the same, that most of what I said today applies to the EWC as well. I certainly wouldn't hesitate to buy an EWC because I am very impressed with this product. And they also seem like a company that would help you out if you did have any issues. I highly recommend this knife if you're looking to spend this kind of money on a knife, and if it's what you're looking for. For me, it's a complete toss-up between these two for my favourite UK legal carry. I really can't decide. I like them both for different reasons. The Hinderer feels like something you could use harder and abuse more, but it's a lot slower in the action department. It's not quite as shiny and as classy looking, despite these wonderful marble carbon scales that I put on it. They both do very different jobs, but the fact that this Slayback is competing with the XM Slippy for me, given it's about half the price, is really rather impressive. It is a wonderful knife. And yeah, if it's up your alley, I definitely think you should get one. Thanks for watching, everybody. Bye-bye.